Thank you for this beautiful presentation. So I want to talk about the event of major dieback of mangrove due to drop level of the sea. Have you observed difference between species during this event, or all the species presented the same behavior?
The latter. They presented the same behaviour.
Okay.
Yeah, there's multiple species there at that site, probably 12 species that were in the video. And they all died back at the high intertidal edge. They died back there. So what the pictures were showing, the entire shoreline fringe had been killed, but the majority of areas away from the more severe areas like that were just at the back edge. But yes, they're all affected equally. Yeah.
Okay. That's an interesting point.
It is, yeah, yeah.
And I got a second question, and after I can. Well, I work on question of forest restoration using soil bioengineering techniques. Do you have heard about this technique in Australia, or is there a development of this kind of techniques that you heard of elsewhere?
Yeah.
For mangrove.
Interesting question, but my question is, well, I'll throw it back to you, is why would you need to do that?
Because, well, in environments with less degradation, where the topography remain suitable for simple plantations, well, that's okay. We make some plantations, protect with fences, but in area more degraded, with more degradation, like urban area, where sometimes some restoration projects can be implemented. That could be interesting to maybe develop hybrid nature-based solutions with some soil bioengineering techniques.
Okay. I think the first thing to establish is what are the soil conditions in your site, and if they require some engineering, then by all means, in other words, I would see it as removing something that is negative. Like there's a pollutant present, or if it's about nutrients, generally that's not a problem because there's usually excess nutrients whenever there's an urban or industrial area nearby. So I would ask that the investigation be done to find out, what is the problem with the soil. But I agree, if there's something, that makes sense to do it, to fix it, it would be a useful methodology, but just as a methodology as such, I would say it's a bit like planting mangroves, right? I'm not an advocate of planting mangroves because quite often people, if they do that, they're not thinking of why the mangroves died in the first place. And they may even be planting in the wrong place. Like what I talked about, growing between mean sea level and high water mark, is something that people who do the planting don't often know. And even in a site, how do you work out where is mean sea level, right, on your mud bank? I mean, I'm talking about simple things because that's where to start, I think, is where I prefer to start. And if you show there is a need for bioengineering, by all means, of course, it would be useful there. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, I think that, well, in Guadeloupe there's a lot of part of Guadeloupe that been highly degraded. Yeah. And the topography of sites are really different today. Yeah. And if we want to restore the original vegetation of this area, maybe it could be interesting to develop such kind of techniques.
Yeah. Well, I think you want every possibility to be somewhere in your bag of tools, of methods. That you would like to use, but even in the methodology of habitat restoration or habitat rehabilitation, because often we can't put back what was there, is I suppose not a definitive science at all. So, and the fact that we it's about that. Finding out more about what's going on and then you can actually do something valuable. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Peut-être quelqu'un d'autre a une question? Allez-y. Allez-y.
Okay, so I am working on mangrove, but only on the marine part of the mangrove. So when you decide to declare that we have a healthy mangrove or dead mangrove, did you have a look about the marine life around the woods of Rhizophoa or any kind of mangrove trees? Or it's only about the mangrove trees, if they are dead or without leaf, or how do you define it? Do you have a focus about the marine life around the mangrove?
Well, absolutely. For example, in where there's an oil spill, a large oil spill, the first thing to die is the fauna, the animals, yeah, and because they get the oil on their breathing surfaces, so they suffocate and die within 1 or 2 days of the oil spill. And usually in more areas than actually where the trees die, but the trees will not die for maybe 6 months after. So it's something that people who study oil spills often get wrong, because oil spill mitigation work usually ends after 1 or 2 months, right? But the major damage has not yet even occurred, right, in the way I just described, where you've got habitat loss. You're getting a loss of fauna, and that's important. So, okay, I wanted to highlight that story just to say that, yes, we do focus on the fauna because they're early indicators of mangrove decline or possibility. And I talked about the interaction with the small crab and the mangroves. Clearly, and we did experiments where you fence off the animals from going into an area, the trees suffer. Okay, the trees shrink, if you like. They lose leaves on the top. So there's quite a lot of work done on the crabs. Also, I've worked on the fish, and we can show relationships where some fish from the estuary go into the mangrove at high tide and come out again as the tide drops, and others don't. Some stay in the channel themselves. So and we've also looked at the experiments with the small crab, for example. Where we hang or tie a small leaf from the tree that's fallen off, tie that on a string, maybe 1 metre long, and then make 30 of these and just put them on the forest and tie on one end of the string onto the root of the tree, and then go away. At low tide, you go away, and you come back maybe an hour later, all those strings are going down to a hole, right? And so you can see what is the leaf removal rate, right? The connection between the tree and the crab. And that's extremely powerful. And students who see that, the students here, it's a really powerful story. Something we don't have in the Pacific Ocean much is herbivory by crabs, right? So you've got a rattus here, I assume, is it? Because there was in Panama, in Bay Las Minas, and those crabs live in the mangrove canopy and go and eat the leaves in the tree. And it's even an ecosystem, because there's other crabs, Goniopsis, living up in there, and he attacks and eats the Aratus crab, so he waits up in the top of the canopy. So there's a whole life of those animals. Of course, you've got birds and you've got reptile, as well as some others as well. But yeah, so we do focus on the animals very much so as indicators, but they're only there because the trees are there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Pas spécialement une question pour...
Pas de souci. Alors moi, je peux peut-être vous en poser une qui pourrait intéresser justement le docteur Duke. Je sais que vous travaillez sur
to Dr. Duke.
du conservatoire de
I know you have been working with the Botanical Observatory in Guadeloupe. Do you work on conservation of mangrove species? Is it part of your plan? And what are the solutions to preserve and conserve these species? Well, first of all, let us remind that we are lucky in Guadeloupe. 63% of residual mangrove, like in Brisbane, 80% in fact are still existing. which is exceptional in the Lesser Antilles. It's not the same in Martinique, for example. So restoration needs of mangroves. I'm just talking of mangroves. So the needs for restoration are not as drastic as it may be for neighboring islands. What we need to understand that mangrove restoration is less less of a trouble, and there's also a great fighting between species for the areas essential parts of the mangroves in Chari, and the technology for restoring is reconquering the original territory. We saw it. Sorry about that. I keep local, but we have something very interesting that was in Volvocama. Volvocama. Okay, the castle, and we can see that they had damage, and 3 years after they stopped polluting, the mangrove has come back, and the animals are back, and the plants are back, and we can see that all the public works are working and in the reconquering of the mangroves. It's above all border protection, and also climate change is also something very important, and see the filters that the mangrove is using. First of all, you need to protect, and second, to let these species continue to grow. So land is an issue. Mangrove is always with soft marshes, so you have red mangroves, white, blacks, and so on, and then soft marshes. And in this situation, what you need to anticipate is the sea rise level, which is very essential for the mangrove. So you need to have land, surface for the growth to continue and expansion. But mangrove is not our main concern, because it's a very competitive system. I was on radio this morning. It is fragile ecosystems because you have invasive species, you have competition, in particular for feeding on the seagrass beds and others, so it's fragile in the land. And when you have areas outside of the sea or brackish water, you have species that are adapted to very specific areas. These are the only species that can benefit from water and land. And mangrove is not an area. Maybe it's the case for Saï, but in mangrove we don't have invasive species to cast out the native species. But at the back, you have the soft marshes. If you remove the trees and there's deforestation, and you have the savanna, you have invasive species, and these spaces are more difficult to restore. For mangrove restoration, we don't have much concern, and then for protection, as part of climate change, we spoke about anticipating so that this ecosystem could go with sea rise level. Of course, the Port Authority did not exist 30 years ago. It's really
Et donc là, on est sur l'optique de est-ce qu'on a envie de mettre
reclaiming
autour de
of
cet
land.
espace-là
So
volet de
on
mangrove
these
pour
areas,
protéger
could
la zone
we
d'infrastructure et la zone
want
des
to
Caraïbes
have a mangrove to protect our infrastructure in Jari against climate change and the dangers? So my question to Professor is, do you have techniques, experiences where they try to restore mangrove, not where the mangrove is native, but we try to create a coastal protection thanks to mangrove? And to go on with my question and to bring more observations, for example, here we have transplant with the peninsula where the Port Authority is. If we do not manage the mangrove, because hydrological issues are important for mangrove and other factors, but if you do not have a protection of this, or you do not manage this, it's no use, because you have low currents and it's not easy to do anything at one time. So my question is that, is it the case that in Australia, where you have planted mangrove voluntarily, that was not native?
There's no need to plant non-native mangrove, because usually the mangroves are suitable. I mean, you would have to demonstrate that the local mangroves are not working or not successful in some way. And it comes back to my key point, which is that we need monitoring to investigate. So I'm talking about monitoring once a year or something. It need not be more regular. It can be. But that monitoring can be done by involving community members, volunteers even, who are interested in their local area, right? And in Australia, we've seen, in other places I've shown in that in my talk, there's people all over the world who are keen to just come and help and do what they can for the environment. But the only restriction has been is that they need the tools, they need the methods, they need the training, the equipment to do that. And it might be as simple as a camera, with GPS inside or something. So monitoring is a key, and you can do that with the volunteer groups who can help, because there is an established methodology. It can be supervised to make sure that the results are something trustworthy for managers like the port or management agencies or even researchers. But it starts there, and then the scientists become involved, or the managers can come involved to do a forensic study to work out where you have some area that might be problematic, meaning that there's been dieback that going on. So my other point is that for every incident where you observe something going wrong with your mangrove forest, dead trees. I mean, I think of the example just out to sea at the end of the street. There's plenty of dead areas there. I don't know if that area is marked for reclamation or not, but it's certainly in trouble by itself. The question would be, what is the thing that's causing those mangroves to be threatened and at risk and dying? It's usually all, pollution and altered drainage is often for this sort of situation. Other places it could be a large oil spill, or it could be severe hurricane damage or something as well. I think it's important with that monitoring to have this information available to you as you make an assessment before you start mitigation work. or restoration, if you like. But I like to think of it as a rehabilitation rather than restoration. Means that you're trying to put back what was there, and usually that's finished, right? Because especially with sea level rise, it's not going down, it's just going up, right? So the idea of having a buffer area at the back. And the other question, I think, is part of what you were talking about was the influence of weeds or species of plants that are in the freshwater edge, and they are bad. They need to be controlled. Because with rising sea level, that's where the new mangroves need to go. If you block their movement, you are condemning these mangroves to die, right? Because if they don't move up with that rising sea level, it's not going down, it's just going up. Mangroves, if they're stuck between mean sea level and the high water mark, then if that's shifting up, they will only survive if they shift up also. So, but you need the land behind available. We call that a buffer area. But however, if people own the land, like on the port, you might have a rock wall or something, or any developed area, there will be a rock wall. The mangroves will die when the sea level pushes up against that. They call that squeeze in English. It's a logical word that just explains that it's something that's going to be annihilated. Of course, it's basically that habitat. If mean sea level reaches the bottom of that rock wall, there's no more mangroves, right? Going to grow there. So hopefully, is that getting to your questions? Yeah. Okay.
Effectivement, il y a beaucoup à dire sur les sujets de restauration de mangroves. Est-ce que vous avez une autre question à poser au docteur Duke?
Is there any other question for Dr. Duke? So, last question. I wanted to speak about mangrove research. Do you think that we know enough in Guadeloupe on mangrove? Is research enough? Is it possible to have funding of research? Is there a possibility for starting research on this subject? Are there enough experts of mangrove in Guadeloupe? I don't know.
Non, blague à part. Mis à part le problème des sous, faut voir que je parle que pour l'université, mais il y a.
I think that for the university,
ça fait longtemps quand même qu'en Guadeloupe, il y a des gens
it's a long time that you have in Guadeloupe people who've been working on this. Professor Porticop, Ambert, Felix, and others have been long-time researchers. Much has been done with the plant, the back mangrove up to the marine aspect. There's still a lot to be done in the marine areas. We have many research on the reefs, whether they're disappearing or not, but on the coastal areas of the mangrove, there's not much for that biodiversity in the mangrove coastal area. There's a lot to be done. Whether on microbiology or others, for us to have beautiful plants, because the microbiome is not enough. So there's good conservation with the park, the observatory that they have. It's well preserved and high microbiological wealth. There's still a lot to know. Bacteria that exist, processes that exist. There's ecosystemic activity that we don't know well. Jennifer has been working on the purifying power of the mangrove for the nitrates and all the other bacteria. 2 centimeters for the largest have been found in Guadeloupe. So you do have a great wealth on the ecosystemic role. There's a lot to be done. And for the BHG, there's also a lot. You can ask Maggie and others, but for the animals and the marine side, there's a lot to be done. Yes, if there are people, donors, to support research, we can say yes. No worry. What about in relation to sargassum? Sargassum, you spoke about it this morning for the seagrass beds. Sargassum stranded can have an effect on the sargassum because it's a huge landmass of organs, and once they've done all these sponges and everything that is found in the mangrove is going to die because sulfur will stifle the plants, the animal. Yes, there is an impact if sargassum gets stranded and are not removed by the water. It ebb and flow. In some areas, there were sargassum with about 60 centimeters of, and then water came with the current, it removed everything. But once they were taken away, then the laguna from Manchao was recovered 3 weeks after. And so the impact is okay, only if they stuck there. But if you manage to remove them, mangroves are resilient to sargassum stifling. And our luck in Guadeloupe is that the largest mangrove expanses are outside of the mangrove and sargassum do not meet, except for Petit Bourg, for example. The most beautiful sargassum, most beautiful mangroves are away from the sargassum ridge. And we've been working on floodings. Also, in some areas, there's still a lot about functioning of species. For example, not all of the species in the mangrove have not been studied. We have structuring species, but there's still a lot to be done for others. So, on the functioning and the response and resilience of the biology in view of climate change, there's still a lot to be found. Thank you. I think that now we can go to the audience for questions and answers.
Just one thing I wanted to mention before we get to open the questions for the audience is that I think with the monitoring we need to know about the mangrove that you've got in your area. I've got a book here about Australia's mangroves, but very recently I did a book on New Caledonia's mangroves. So it's got every mangrove there, and when I went to New Caledonia to do these studies, I found a new species of Rhizophora there. The possibility is that you may have species that you don't know are there. How many species do you have in Guadeloupe? I believe there's about 8. That's a question. And we're coming.
So now you've basically named 12% of the whole mangrove species, right? Yeah, I've been calculating this. So we've got one question here, another one there. Une question au fond aussi, c'est ça? Voilà, en tout cas, on va commencer. On a une petite demi-heure devant nous. N'ayez crainte. Je vous en prie, Pascaline.
Thank you very much for these presentations and the complementarity of all the panels. My question is, we heard this morning from Dr. Reya Gupi and from Dr. Fanny Carlinon that the drivers of the different factors threatening the ecosystems of corals and seagrass meadows. And one of them was that a lot of diseases are created by the changes in the environment, and also stress. But listening to you, I have the idea that maybe it doesn't exist for mangroves. So would you say that the mangroves are more resilient than the two other ecosystems because this stress doesn't affect them, except when they have really like anthropic factors, or if they have like the different of sea level rise, but which are really like objective factors, I mean not endemic factors or threats. That was my first question. And my second question, that was it. That was, do you think that they are more resilient? And do you think that, did you notice also the same factor of stress, which could develop also diseases and other factors which will affect the mangroves?
Please take your time to answer and to speak for the mental sanity of our friends in the back.
Right,
Thank you very much.
Mangroves can get stressed, yes. And of course, I've talked about the extreme examples, but they can also get sublethal stress as well, whether it be chemical pollution from herbicide, or other factors. Obviously, they are resilient, for sure. There's no doubt that mangroves are resilient, but you do need to be aware of the vulnerabilities of the different species to different stresses. Like, remember I talked about the herbicide influence on the mangroves? I showed a picture where there was dieback, species-specific dieback affecting Avicennia and not Rhizophora. The reason that I propose for that being the case is that Avicennia has leaky roots, right? It allows large molecules inside, and anyone that knows about Avicennia will know that they get salt on their leaves, right? Because they excrete the salt. Just like humans perspire or sweat, Avicennia perspires and sweats, and it's got special salt-excreting glands on the leaves. But they're large molecules, the sodium chloride, and that makes them... but Rhizophora does not have leaky roots, right? So it keeps the salt out at its roots, right? So the plants have different mechanisms for dealing with, or different physiology for dealing with salt. But the problem is that the Avicennia, with its leaky roots, also lets in large molecules like herbicide, and that gets inside and it can interrupt a reproductive process as sublethal influences, and ultimately kills the plants in the more extreme concentrations. It's different for sure. We don't have things like white or black spot or whatever. I mean, the things that Ria was talking about with corals. That is absolutely incredible. I don't know about seagrass, so we do know they've got epiphytes that live on the leaves and things, or other things. But maybe that's a question for Fanny as well. But anyway, but mangroves seem to be resilient. They would not be where they are if they weren't. Remember, they've been on Earth for more than 50 million years, right? Think of humans. We've only been around 1 million. Mangroves are doing pretty good. When I look at a mangrove forest today, I look at them as survivors of all the changes that have been going on over 50 million years. And you know that sea level's been down 100 metres or more, and in many places, and those mangroves only restricted to that tidal zone, and yet they've gone down and they've come back up, and they're still here. So the species that we see today are the survivors of more than 50 million, so 80 million. It could, we can be, some species go back that far. So they're very resilient, and they have well-developed mechanisms for recovery and rehabilitation already. And that's what I talked about, this being a viviparous propagule. Tell me a land plant that you know that does this, right? That makes vivipary. these plants are highly developed to promote one thing, that's rejuvenation. I mean, meaning replanting of the forest that they create. They're very special plants. Okay.
Bonjour, encore moi. Donc, c'est pas vraiment une question, c'est juste, je vais répondre sur l'intervention.
Good morning. It's not a real question. It's an observation. The activity that we have on the mangrove is not just about replanting in the port area or at sea. It is true that we also reclaim land and we account for natural regeneration having to do with the hydrology. So my question is for Dr. Duke. When do you think or do you assess that human intervention is indispensable, and what are the criteria? We've seen it in your indicators. What are the criteria that a manager of space, marine space, should have to have less costly operation monitoring? Because it's high budgets and you could have feedback of experience, but for you there's not a price to be assessed to the mangrove, but it would be too much. But what is the cost and benefit equation? Okay, do we give it up, or is
so
it
in a nutshell, basically, at what point is a human intervention called for, and what kind of low-cost indicators can we develop?
Okay, the important thing is that all the methods that I use are low cost. Okay, I mean, it's the whole thing, working with communities. They don't have large grants of money, and there's enough in it to pay for their monitoring, etc. If you want me to put dollars on, or your euros on it, I can do that. But the thing is that the methodologies I've especially developed are low cost. I think that's probably the main message, and that quite often you can do as very little and get a lot in reward for it if you just set things in motion. Like knowing the sort of habitat that you want or you would like. If you're talking about creating land, though, mangroves are not on the land, right? So they're below high water mark. Okay, so if you did not have the mangroves there, it would be a sandy beach or a sand bank or something, a mud bank. True. So it's often a misconception that mangroves are land. They don't grow on the land. Yeah, it's as simple as that. And people talk about mangrove islands. Well, not really. You know, they're just a mangrove mud bank. They just happen to be trees that grow lower than the high sea level. They're not terrestrial trees. But mapping, for example, you see people who draw maps, they draw a line around the mangrove edge of the shoreline. No, that's not the shoreline. The shoreline is at the other side. All I'm saying is that there are things that make sense and that can be, I suppose, created in their own way. Mangroves are very good at replanting themselves. Okay, I'm not saying that planting is no good, because clearly there are circumstances where planting is highly beneficial, but it's just a case of monitoring to figure out what you need to do. Planting is just one thing in your tool kit to use that you can, as well as checking the soil and other features. And like I said, knowing that elevation range that they will occupy. And usually that's the first thing I do in a rehabilitation project, is that you sculpture the land, coastline, shoreline, and then you work out where the mangrove sweet spot, it makes sense, sweet spot, the preferred spot will be on that slope, and then you can plant on that if you feel a need to, but the mangroves will come eventually by themselves.
Alors, y a-t-il d'autres questions? Je ne voyais pas de main levée. Je ne vois toujours pas de main levée.
Si. D'autres.
Okay, in the absence of any other questions.
J'en ai une.
I have a question.
Absolument. Une à toi, une à moi.
Allez, on fait comme ça.
Okay.
I have one question for you, Mr. Duke. On a vu dans votre présentation que vous...
Okay. You said that you had the community for monitoring. Can you tell us? Because you didn't tell us exactly how the community groups can help on research on the mangrove for remote detections, for example. How do you associate the local populations?
Well, one thing is you call a community meeting, and what we usually do is make it a special event, a cultural event, where people might write some poetry about the mangroves or about the shoreline or artwork or theatre. But to have some show, because if I just go and talk to the community, we'll get 10 people maybe turn up. It depends what. But if I have a cultural show about mangroves, I'll get 200 people will come. So firstly is engagement, okay? And the next level then is the methods, to talk to people, work out why they are interested in the mangroves. And usually you find there's no lack of enthusiasm. No lack of enthusiasm. We don't have to go around and generate it or anything. People are already interested. They just need someone like us to go and talk to them, someone with some knowledge already. And in our case, we have methodology and of course, and there are community grants schemes, like I know the port I work with in Australia, the Gladstone Ports Corporation, it's on the east coast of Australia. They have a community grant system where they give a few thousand dollars in my case to community groups to go out and do some project that's about environmental management or monitoring, and it's very effective. I'm not sure if you do the same thing here. Maybe already. No? Okay. Yeah. Well, I know. I'm only giving an example, then, of course. But that was the question. How do we do it in Australia? But there are international grants you can also apply for to get. You don't need much for a community group to do some valuable work. They do need to follow the methodology, so they do need the equipment, which could cost a few $1,000s to have them with the equipment that we know, as from my point of view, that it's going to give me the results that we need. So I call that data acquisition is what they do, and that could be just filming the shoreline, just as shown in that shoreline video assessment method. Okay, all they need is a GPS unit and a camera, and they can do that work, or they got to usually find a boat to go and do the work. But you may only have 5 people to do the actual on the ground work. So after that, it's really just a matter of working with people to find out what they would be interested in doing. It could be classroom or school groups, and I answered the question. Okay, yes, education is very important too. So it could be a school group, and they may take it on as their project, because we've got groups in Australia at high school that have special projects that go out and measure carbon sequestration. Okay, and we measure I've got a corer, that means a device to go down and dig into the mud to get a sample. So we can get samples at different levels. They do that. They bought their own corer, right? $600 or something. And that big rod that I talked about, you shove it down to find out how deep the mud layer is with the peat. And that becomes a class subject, and every year the new batch of students in that class go out and collect another set of the same sites and collect more data. You can do that with your community group as well, and it is being done. So
thank you.
Carbon sequestration is a good handle because they can put dollar value, euro value on the amount of carbon that's being sequestered.
Well, we're already over time by 10 minutes, so maybe I'll save my question for tomorrow or some private talks. Let's give a round of applause to this panel, ladies and gentlemen.